Okay, it's first of all a pleasure and honor to be here, and I would like to thank Sibyl and Jason for having me. So today I want to look at Ginsberg's connection with William Blake, but I want to look at it from a slightly different angle than the one that has usually been privileged. Indeed, as I will remind you all very briefly, Ginsberg was very marked by William Blake because he had an ecstatic experience spontaneously generated by Blake's poetry, which transformed his life. But though a lot of commentary exists on that from a shamanic point of view, religious, spiritual point of view, very little exists as to how this experience actually proved foundational also for Ginsberg's sense of environment, for Ginsberg's environmental consciousness. So that is what I want to focus on today. And of course, Ginsberg's environmental consciousness is extremely vast as a topic. So I believe this is work in progress, and I really believe that there are many aspects of Blake's sense of the non-human other that transfer onto Ginsberg's poetry. I can't possibly discuss them all here. And really, what I would like to focus on more specifically is the sense of ambivalence towards the non-human other. The sense of ambivalence, meaning that whilst there is an embrace of the more than human, there is also a wariness, a defiance towards it when this more than human other is not processed by the human imagination. So Ginsberg's ambivalence towards the natural world, that will be my mini focus for today, if I may say so, and indeed how this ambivalence is inherited from Blake and from Blake's poetry, but also from the ecstatic experience that Ginsberg had thanks to Blake's poetry. That will indeed be the center of my talk. I say talk because although I have extensive notes, and I will from time to time, refer to them, this is after all in conversation with, so I will also speak very freely most of the time and indeed keep it going as a conversation. Now, the first question that arises is, why do we even need to bother, quote unquote, about Ginsberg's environmental consciousness amongst the Beat generation in general? Because the Beat generation is credited, not least by Ginsberg himself, as indeed having contributed an ecological awakening to culture, a countercultural ecological awakening to mainstream American and Western culture in the second half of the 20th century. I project here a quote from Ginsberg's own assessment of the Beat generation, an assessment that goes back to 1981. And indeed, Ginsberg highlights that, yes, the Beat generation, amongst many other countercultural traits, is indeed, well, a generation of writers and artists who developed or helped to develop the spread of ecological consciousness, as emphasized early on by Gary Snyder and Michael McClure, the notion of a fresh planet. So in the Beat's opposition to the military-industrial machine civilization, the environmental consciousness played a very big part in the Beat's striving towards a second religiousness developing within an advanced civilization. Again, well, the care for the environment and the reconnection with the environment were central. This is a very interesting quote on the part of Ginsberg, because if you read, the quote absent-mindedly, you get the impression that, well, Ginsberg's ecological commitment, uh, you know, is beyond question, that, it's very natural, that it happened early on, that, well, he was really on a par with writers like Gary Snyder and Michael McClure within the Beat movement. Well, that is actually not at all so, because Ginsberg's ecological consciousness, compared to other beat writers, developed actually fairly late in the game. If you read his complete works, well, you notice that up to the early to mid 60s, most of his poetry is predominantly about people. Uh, sure, there are environments, but mostly urban environments. There is allusion to toxic and diseased urban environments, but definitely the non-human other does not feature prominently in his early verse, except, as I will explain in a minute, when he's trying actually to recycle some of Blake's songs into modern American parlance. So again, compared to Snyder and McClure, Ginsberg was not on the environmental barricades early on, and he was more of a follower than an initiator, let me repeat. And again, it is really only in the second half of his career that he's actually, voicing an environmentalist activist voice through his verse. Yes, in The Fall of America, he is actually fighting for the the American wilderness that has become completely diseased and completely, basically, stifled by American consumerism and the imprint of the human. Again, we might say in contemporary parlance that The Fall of America is indeed fallen consciousness precipitating an ecological fall, and it is a poem about both humans, the human mind, and human creation needing redemption out of the fall, which is very Blakean by definition, Blakean scholars would say. But again, that is quite late in the game. 1965, 1972. Well, before that, uh, there is, quantitatively speaking, more urban space than space in which non-human activity, non-human forms of creation are acknowledged, and definitely the sense of the defense of an environment is fairly limited. So we might, of course, ask ourselves why? Why is that? Is it that, well, Ginsberg was simply born in the city and awakened very late to the reality of the non-human other outside urbanization? Is it perhaps that he was so used to toxic environments that in eco-critical terms we would say, well, he's actually suffering from eco-trauma. His psychology is so traumatized that he can't even relate to the non-human other anymore? Or are there perhaps other reasons why there is actually so little representation of the non-human other, and so little representation of the non-human other on its own terms, giving it the foreground, accepting actually, to open the writerly imagination to the agentiveness of the non-human? Well, my thesis here is that there are indeed other reasons. There are Blakean reasons, because, in fact, both the poetry and the ecstatic experience that this poetry catalyzed. So the Blakean songs and the Blake hallucination, Blake epiphany, Blake ecstasy that Ginsberg experienced back in 1948, at the end of July 1948 to be precise. These are elements that are not neutral when it comes to the environment. They are actually, again, foundational and carry an ambivalence towards the non-human other. Now, before I concentrate on the Blake epiphany slash hallucination slash ecstasy itself, it's actually a good thing to very briefly go back to Blake's divided, complex position towards nature. Because indeed, well, if we just take some very well-known and representative quotes, well, in a nutshell, we understand that the sense of nature is not uniform in Blake, anything but. And that is perhaps, why Blake is extremely interesting to eco-criticism, as indeed I argued in a piece that will come out at the end of the month in the Wale magazine, devoted to Blake and nature. So perhaps Jason will talk about the launch of the magazine at the end of today's session, but just going to highlight a couple of things that I point out in this piece. Again, well, Blake's own words speak volumes, because on the one hand, we have a writer, an artist who claims that to see a world in a grain of sand, in a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. A robin redbreast in a cage puts all heaven in a rage. A dove house filled with doves and pigeons shudders hell through all its regions. A dog starved at his master's gate predicts the ruin of the state. So here in this section from the Auguries of Innocence, we have indeed, well, the enchanted sense of a correspondence between microcosm and macrocosm. We have the attentive gaze to the very minute particulars of nature. We also have actually an outrage expressed at the oppression of nature. So the oppression of nature results actually in the ruin of the state. So if you oppress nature, it has social reverberations. It actually creates evil and toxicity and cruelty at the level of social ecology. So, of course, when you read the statement, you have the impression of an incredibly sympathetic view towards nature. Yes, but Blake is also the writer who says nature has no outline, but imagination has. Nature has no tune, but imagination has. Nature has no supernatural and dissolves. Imagination is eternity. Nature is imagination itself. So these different quotes from Blake show you that, well, indeed, contrary to a number of people in the ecological and eco-critical community today, so contrary to a number of people in the environmentalist movement and a number of people in the scholarly community studying environmental discourse, there is actually a refusal to background the human in favor of nature. There is actually a refusal to embrace undifferentiated nature that is not actually filtered through the faculty of the human, the faculty of the imagination. So repeatedly in Blake, I mean, what we find is actually a fear of being subsumed into a lumpish, undifferentiated, non-human other. And a number of Blake critics have pointed that out, especially Kevin Hutchins, who has written an admirable book on Blake and the environment. And again, Hutchins, but also others, like Lefkowitz, Damon, Peter Ackroyd also point out that, well, ambivalence, complexity, nuance, that is what we have regarding Blake's stance towards nature. So again, to put it in ecological, eco-critical terms, for Blake, there is absolutely no question of accepting to be more co-constituted by the non-human than the human co-constitutes nature. Where man is not, nature is barren, says Blake. So this idea of opening yourself to nature to the point that you are more co-constituted by it than you and your imagination and your faculty of creation constitute the perception of the non-human other, that is unacceptable to Blake. So fusing within the primordial, fusing into the undifferentiated primitive, that is actually deeply troubling to Blake. Human imagination has to fertilize nature, has to fertilize the material components of the universe for the harmony between the human and the non-human even to begin to emerge and exist. So it's a very complex position, and of course also a position very much influenced by Blake's Gnosticism, very much influenced by a distrust of the material body. Well, the material universe being the prison from which you have to emerge in part. So let me just, for example, refer you to one of the poems that triggered Ginsberg's Blake ecstasy in 1948, to Tirzah, well, thou mother of my mortal part, with cruelty didst mold my heart, and with false self-deceiving tears didst bind my nostrils, eyes, and ears, didst close my tongue in senseless clay, and me to mortal life betray. So again, Tirzah has been analysed as a Gnostic piece, and a piece indeed conveying the sense of the senseless clay, the mortal body, well, the body of the five senses being the prison of incarnation, out of which, of course, the human and the imagination have to emerge. Also, next to Tirzah, we have the sunflower, our sunflower, the sick rose, and also the little girl lost, the little girl found diptych, also referred to as the Leica poem. Well, the Leica poem, the sick rose, the sunflower to Tirzah, these are songs of experience that are definitely, as I already pointed out, not neutral as regards nature. Because the rose, for example, well, the rose is beautiful, but the rose is also corruptible and corrupted by material creation. the worm penetrating the rose, well, corrupts not only the physical flower, but also perhaps the imagination, the blossom of the imagination for which the flower might stand. So without getting into all the ramifications of the poem, and we can discuss them later on in the question and answer session, I mean, again, what we have here is, yes, a flower rooted in earth, but a flower whose material incarnation is not problematic. Not unproblematic, I'm sorry, not unproblematic. It is indeed highly problematic because what you see is, yes, physical material beauty, but also, well, the agencies of the non-human linked to death and decay. Our sunflower, well, you have the sunflower trapped in earth and aspiring to merge with the light of the sun, but it remains indeed trapped in the material. So again, the material reality of the flower also conveys an imprisonment in physical nature. It is, again, well, physical nature, the non-human other, preventing liberation, preventing the flourishing of the imagination, preventing also, well, the flourishing of consciousness as attuned to the divine light. In the Laika poems, well, actually, the little girl, lost and then found, roams the physical wilderness, and indeed the physical wilderness represents the fallen material world. So it is quite interesting that the songs that catalyzed Ginsberg's Blake hallucination are all songs that present a rather divided relation to material physical creation, to the non-human other, highlighting its beauty, but also highlighting that that world is a world of corruption and decay and imprisonment for the human mind and imagination. Now, what happened in 1948, very briefly, and if you just allow me, I will have a sip of tea before explaining that to you. Well, Ginsberg was reading these songs of experience, and all of a sudden he had the impression of the voice of Blake coming out of the book and reciting the verse to him. But all of a sudden, he also had the impression of the universe turning inside out and cohering, lifting the veil onto a kind of ultimate principle. And indeed, Ginsberg oscillates considerably because sometimes, well, you have the impression that this divine principle is a he, a person. But at other times, you have the impression that that divine principle is an it, an impersonal principle. Again, we can discuss that more at length in the Q&A session. And if you want more details about the different versions that Ginsberg gave regarding, I mean, this hallucinatory moment, which made him convinced that, on the one hand, there was more than just the material surface of the universe. There was more to the universe than just its material appearance as normally processed by eye and ear, by the ordinary senses. And it was also an experience that convinced him of a shamanic mission for the poet. He, like Blake, had to actually reveal what was hiding beyond these material surfaces, to reveal what was hiding, beyond a consciousness uncleansed and limited by the five senses only. So I was saying, if you're interested in the different renditions, different versions that Ginsberg gave of that moment, there was an excellent talk by a good friend of mine, Luke Walker, back in the Global Blake Conference of January 2022, and it is available on the Global Blake Archive. I am not going to repeat what Luke Walker gave a very good synopsis of. What I'm going to do here is just point out to you that actually there are some pretty terrifying moments to, well, this episode of ecstasy. Because yes, it is a liberatory episode. Indeed, Ginsberg feels that he has seen, well, an ultimate divine energy has revealed itself to him. And indeed, the world coheres in part. And the world actually, well, endows him with a mission to be the artist that reveals what hides behind the material. But when you read the different versions that Ginsberg gives of this moment, well, you see that indeed doom, threat, the fear of being engulfed by the material are not absent from the experience, because here the initial moment of wonder changed into a darker mood of ecstasy when what Ginsberg supposed to be Blake's voice intoned the sick rose, making him feel in his very flesh that the poem applied to the whole universe, like hearing the doom of the whole universe, and at the same time the inevitable beauty of doom. So in fact, well, the experience helps him to merge with the divine, yet at the same time, the experience also throws him back upon himself to the point that he feels in the position of the sick rose we just talked about a moment ago. Also, if we read further, well, Ginsberg attributes sinister, primitive animal features to this sort of divine principle that invades the entire universe and his entire being, in turns actually foreshadowing the imagery of his psychedelic poetry, an imagery to which I will actually return, because mark the words, I moved across the room with the gnawing pulse of animality engulfing my body with slow carnal undulations of my frame. Now, the gnawing pulse of animality engulfing my body with slow carnal undulations of my frame, we are very far here from the kind of animism embraced by Michael McClure or Gary Snyder, for example. I mean, animality engulfs you. So animality also, well, annuls you as an imaginative creature. Animality also, well, co-constitutes you more than you constitute it. And of course, the slow carnal undulations of my frame, what kind of creature does that remind us of? Well, inevitably, you are reminded of a sort of polypus-like creature, a creature that is indeed very Blakean, a creature with huge Blakean undertones. We have the image of the polypus in Vala, in Milton, in Jerusalem. And of course, the polypus, it's the tentacles of a consciousness completely obsessed by reason and materiality. It is the tentacles stifling imagination in part. It is the tentacles of the veil of nature imposing itself upon the imagination. Well, those are the associations that we find in Blake's work in connection with the polypus, as again, Damon, Hutchins, and others have pointed out. Now, if we go even further, so indeed, there's an episode here that I haven't even sort of included in the PowerPoint, in which, I mean, you know, after reading the human abstract, actually, so the human abstract was also involved in that Blakean episode on top of, you know, the 4 songs that I have already mentioned. Well, Ginsberg went into a bookstore, and, you know, in this bookstore, all of a sudden he has the impression that everybody is wearing an animal face, a kind of animal mask. So once more, deepening what he experienced upon reading Our Sunflower, The Sick Rose, I mean, you know, the Leica poems. Well, you know, with the human abstract and going out into society, he sees actually animal faces all around him. And these animal faces are anything but reassuring, are anything but provoking the sense of a desirable union with animal being. Again, there isn't any sort of attraction to the primitive as we have in Snyder or McClure. And then there was, again, when Ginsberg tried to sort of deepen the initial experience, he went onto the Columbia campus one night, and indeed, he tried to sort of refocus his mind on Blake's The Sick Rose, but the divine manifested itself as an annihilating consciousness, too threatening for the poet to handle, ending with a feeling which was sudden, relating to the black crawling appearance of the sky, the Father universe itself. Yes, there was nothing apparent, physical, uncanny, a non-human, implacably alien presence to eat me up then and there. So the sky, this crawling, undifferentiated, lumpish mass of the material, we might say, well, it's not at all a heaven. It is actually an alien presence that threatens to swallow him, a motif that we see repeated over and over again in Ginsberg's poetry, particularly in his psychedelic poetry. And indeed, there is this fear of the undifferentiated lumpish material entirely invading him. So, in other words, entirely constituting him, with the human imagination no longer having much of a say in the weaving of perception, in the weaving of the relation to the material world. So let me repeat once more, let me come back to this leitmotif. Here, definitely, again, well, the uncanny sense of divinity is indeed, well, you know, the black crawling appearance of the sky. So the non-human other, fairly undifferentiated, massive and lumpish, threatening to co-constitute Ginsberg more than Ginsberg ever has a chance to constitute it, to impose his imagination, to impose his creative faculties onto the material world. So again, what I think requires far more research is, well, the very divided, ambivalent sense of the environment that well, the Blake epiphany actually corresponds to. It's not just that there are different versions of it, as Luke Walker reminded us back in January 22. But actually, when you look very closely at the vocabulary, whenever Ginsberg tries to talk about different episodes, different moments of the epiphany, well, whenever the animal or the non-human other uh, occurs in the Lexis, it is actually in a fairly threatening guise that it does so. And indeed, Ginsberg felt his imagination liberated on the one hand, but also he felt his imagination threatened with a deep fear of being co-constituted by the broader universe more than he had a chance to constitute it. So, again, how does that transpire? And it is a very Blakean sense of the undifferentiated, lumpish material that remains barren without the filter, without the transformation of the human imagination. So, again, this Blakean epiphany will at first repeatedly make it into Ginsberg's verse, in the form of attempts, literally, well, to copy the sunflower, to copy the rose, often to sort of merge them into one and the same poem. So here you have very early adaptation on reading William Blake's The Sick Rose, still couched in fairly cryptic language that becomes far more Americanized, far more natural in the next piece, which is again the precursor to one of Ginsberg's most important adaptations of Blake, the Sunflower Sutra. But note that even in American parlance, well, the flower does not stand in and for itself. The flower is yoked to a spiritual agenda of transformation through the imagination. The flower, well, again, it's a flower treated basically by the imagination of the poet, so constituted by the mind of the poet. It's not the mind of the poet allowing the flower in its alien being, in its alien isness, to constitute him. Now, also, even when Ginsberg in the early poetry tries to actually refer to the dynamic agencies of the human, non-human other, well, it's still done as here by reference, not so hidden reference, to the rose, the sunflower, the emblematic nature motifs that indeed Blake treated imaginatively. So the rambler vine climbed up the cottage post, the leaves in the night still where the day had placed them, the animal heads of the flowers where they had arisen to think of the sun. One is really struck by the difficulty that Ginsberg has to move away from the emblematic, symbolic, Blakean treatment of nature and to open himself up just to the agencies of a form of creatureliness, of a form of creation that is actually alien, other than, well, the agency of the human being. Also, well, yes, Ginsberg, like Blake, embraces the beauty of flowers, the beauty of the garden, but he's also very, very attentive to bugs, worms, to the less palatable aspects of lumpish material, undifferentiated creation, as here, for example, when we are in Siesta and Chivalva, where he fears again being engulfed by the jungle. And again, well, Kaddish, famous iconic poem mourning for his mother. Well, part 5 is highly ambiguous because, again, we have the invocation to the Lord, the divinity, alternating with caw, 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 the shrieks of the crows, and the shrieks of the crows in their alien agentiveness, in their alien form of being, seem really to represent a threat to regeneration and to possible resurrection. So again, nature here seems to be a competitor to the human imagination and to human transformation, an element we can again discuss more in the Q&A session. Then, just for my final considerations, let me actually come to a piece like Lysergic Acid, a piece that is usually completely ignored because it is, hallucinated poetry and drug-induced poetry. Well, I think the drug-induced poetry of Ginsberg is really ignored at one's peril, because it is perhaps there that the divided sense of nature and a Blakean-coloured divided sense of nature most appears. And of course, when you dismiss drug poetry as, just being, hallucinated verse, the man was not quite himself when he wrote it, well, you can also take a counter stance and say, actually, hallucination, like inebriation, perhaps reveals the deeper structures of your consciousness, the deeper structures of your mind and way of thinking. You cannot dissemble anymore. Well, in Lysergic Acid, Ginsberg contemplates a meditation support named a mandala. It's interesting that right at the opening of the poem, we again have the sense of invading, threatening animal agency, and animal agency undulating, basically tentacle-like towards, the observer. And again, this is imagery which to a Blakean scholar brings to mind the polypus and its symbols of the dangers of the material world stifling imagination. And indeed, here there's a sense of lostness, separateness that, persists throughout the poem. A poem so complex, I can't totally analyze it here. Again, we could talk about it more in the discussion, but note, a worm, lost, separated, a worm. Again, the imagery of the sick rose also permeates the composition, and throughout the hallucination, you again have very much the sense of doom, of the early Ginsberg, who was thrown back upon himself to be actually in the position of the sick rose eaten up by the worm of decay, eaten up by the agencies of the non-human other over which the human imagination has no control. Also, note a we, and that must be a nit and a they and a thing with a no answer. Once more, we have this tentacle-like undulating being. And what is very interesting, it is not my word, not poetry. So it is not my hope. One of the deepest moments of despair is when this monster, which seems to be, polypus, spider, which seems to be a multitude of facets and creatures, a multitude of embodiments of being in succession. Well, one of the heart of the suffering experienced by Ginsberg is the fact that this polypus eats up his imagination. It's not my word, not poetry. Contrasting again with what we have in other beat poets, for whom the opening to the primordial, the primitive, actually constitutes an activation of poetry, not a stifling of poetry. And indeed, the end of lysergic acid is perhaps to be taken literally. It is ambiguous and cryptic, but one image in the end remains myriad-eyed in eternity. This is the work, this is the knowledge, this is the end of man. Well, this is the end of man. We can read it in multiple ways, but we can also read it as this is the end of the human imagination, constituting, co-constituting the perception of the material more than it is constituted by the alien non-human other. So in other words, this is the end of man who can fertilize and redeem the fallen material world through the imagination. This is one of the possible Blakean interpretations, actually, in this poem. So I think it's high time now to open the floor to Q&As. But again, what I wanted very briefly here to emphasize today is the fact that the divided connection to the non-human other in Blake, that is what Ginsberg also experienced early on in this foundational, formative Blake hallucination. And that this divided sense of, the material world, the divided connection to the material world, is indeed what differentiates Ginsberg really from many other beat voices at the ecological level. And in fact, I think that the reason why Ginsberg has not been satisfactorily discussed environmentally and ecologically is because people have tried to squeeze him in with Snyder, McClure, and other poets willfully opening themselves up to the primordial, primitive, lumpish, undifferentiated material, accepting it to annihilate human imagination. Whereas Ginsberg has not. Whereas Ginsberg's Blakean roots prevent him from doing so. So thank you for your attention, and of course I will gladly